In the autumn of 1873, there lived a woman whom the entire city believed it knew, though no one had ever truly stopped to look at her. They knew her name, they knew her family, and they knew that murmur that followed her through the imperial halls like a shadow sewn to her footsteps. The ugly one of the Bonacells, they said, with that elegant cruelty that high society practiced almost as an art. Margaret Eloise Bonacelle was 26 years old, possessed an intelligence capable of illuminating any room, and a restrained posture belonging to someone who had learned far too early that occupying space was a privilege which, according to others, did not belong to her. But what Viennese society never understood, and what would later shake it in a way it would never manage to digest, was that there is an essential difference between a woman no one looks at and a woman who does not exist. Margaret existed. She existed with a silent intensity that only attentive eyes could perceive. And then, one October night that smelled of damp wood and candle wax, the most unattainable man in Vienna saw her. Have you ever been judged before you could say a single word? Have you ever felt the weight of a judgment you did not ask for, of a nickname you did not deserve, of an absence no one noticed because no one ever took the trouble to look for you? Tell me from where you are listening to this story today. Do you believe someone can find you when the entire world has taught its eyes not to see you? This is the story of Margaret, and of everything that the refined cruelty of Vienna never expected. The imperial city awoke that autumn with the same ritual as always. Carriages crossed the cobbled streets under a silvery grey morning sky. Flower vendors set up their stalls along the Ringstrasse. Servants opened the windows of the palaces to let in an air that smelled of fallen leaves and distant smoke from bakeries. Vienna moved with the assurance of one who knows exactly who she is, a city of waltzes, of conventions, of titles worn like heavy jewels, of smiles rehearsed to express only what social rank permitted. Margaret Bonacelle woke before any of her cousins, not because she was obliged to, though in some way she always was, but because the hours before the house awoke were the only ones that belonged to her completely. She would sit by the window of her room, the smallest of the chambers on the second floor of the mansion of the Baroness von Hargrave, with a cup of tea in her hands and a book on her knees, and she would let the morning silence fill her in a way the noise of the day never could. Her room said much about the place they had assigned her in that house. While the rooms of Adelaide and Constance, Hargrave's daughters, were filled with French fabrics, mirrors with gilded frames, and perfume bottles carefully arranged on mahogany dressing tables, Margaret's room had an iron bed with a dark green wool coverlet, a birch writing desk with a drawer that creaked, and 2 bookshelves, which were without a doubt the most valuable things in the whole space. There was no large mirror, only a small metal oval above a porcelain basin, sufficient to check that her hair was in order, that her dress had no stains, and that her appearance was correct enough not to provoke shame. Margaret was 26 years old when this story begins, and in her appearance there was a fundamental contradiction that a quick glance never managed to resolve. Her features, taken separately, were considered excessive according to the fashion of the time. Her amber eyes were too large, her mouth too wide, her chin too firm. Her hazelnut brown hair had a timid wave that resisted all discipline. Her cousin spoke of her with that calculated kindness of those who know exactly how much a word can wound. She did not inherit the same generosity of features as the rest of the family, they said. Margaret had heard it so many times that for a while she even came to believe it. But there was something she never managed to believe, no matter how much they tried to convince her, that her mind was a defect. That reading Schiller was strange. That asking the music professor about the harmonic structure of a sonata instead of simply playing it was an extravagance. That having an opinion on the politics of Austria, being a young unmarried woman of good family, was something situated between the uncomfortable and the impossible. And so, night after night, Baroness Hilda Hargrave Bonacelle took her niece to the social events of Vienna as one carries a necessary decorative object. The Baroness was 60 years old and possessed the coldness of a person who had spent decades perfecting the art of appearing generous, while practicing exactly the opposite. Tall, with white hair always impeccably gathered in a severe bun, she invariably wore tones of pearl grey or Prussian blue, adorned with inherited sapphires that proclaimed a lineage she defended with the ferocity of a gamekeeper. Her eyes were small, grey, and had the unsettling quality of calculating without rest. People, situations, advantages, and disadvantages. Everything was weighed with the precision of a merchant evaluating a piece of silk. Lady Hilda's motivation was, at its core, simple. Baron Ernest, Margaret's father, had died leaving a respectable name and a fortune eroded by decades of poor management and imprudent generosity. Margaret's guardianship, and with it the modest resources that belonged to her by right, had passed to Lady Hilda's control with that naturalness with which things happen when no one pays attention. If Margaret were to marry well, If some important man decided to look past the rumors and see what was hidden behind those amber eyes, the inheritance would be claimed, the guardianship would end, and Lady Hilda would lose access to a flow of money she had grown accustomed to considering her own. It was cold, perfectly adjusted arithmetic, and Lady Hilda executed it with mastery. In the halls, the tactic was always the same. Adelaide and Constance were presented with enthusiasm. My dear daughters, so charming, so talented. Margaret, in contrast, was mentioned in passing, almost as a margin note, and my niece, who accompanies us tonight. Her surname was never pronounced with the due prestige, she was never introduced in a convenient manner, and no letter from a possible suitor ever reached her hands intact. Once, a kind widow named Mrs. Bonaventure attempted to engage her in a conversation about the recent concerts at the Music Verein. Lady Hilda deflected the topic with an elegance that only an attentive observer would have recognized as deliberate. Margaret observed. She had spent years observing. And so we arrive at that October night when everything began to change. The gala ball at the Herzenberg Palace was one of the most anticipated events of the Viennese season. The palace opened its doors to the most distinguished families, or at least the best dressed, and the orchestra was already playing the first waltz while carriages were still lining up before the main entrance. The Winter Garden, surrounded by marble and with fireplaces in the corners, gave off a scent of late roses mixed with the French perfumes of the ladies. The crystal chandeliers spilled a golden light over 200 people who spun, smiled, conspired, and showed off with the joyful discipline of those who had always known their role in the performance. Margaret entered with her family an hour after the ball had begun, when the hall was already full enough for her arrival to go unnoticed. She suspected that schedule had been chosen by Lady Hilda precisely for that reason. She wore a dress of dark moss green wool, simple in cut but well fitted to her figure, with long sleeves and a high collar of cream lace. She wore no jewels save for a small oval amber brooch that had belonged to her mother, discreetly pinned over her heart. Her hair was gathered in a bun that had miraculously survived the battle with Constance, and two maids determined to secure it with more hairpins than necessary. Lady Hilda guided the group towards a circle of matrons near the central fountain, where Adelaide and Constance were immediately surrounded by their usual admirers, young men in starched uniforms and heirs to small palaces, capable of recognizing a promising dowry at a distance. Margaret discreetly stepped aside toward a side wall of the hall. She found a table slightly withdrawn behind a cream marble column and took from the folds of her dress a small volume of poetry she had hidden there since morning. It was Heine. The book was so worn that the spine was beginning to detach. She read for almost an hour. Around her, Vienna spun, laughed, and schemed. She walked through gardens of words, following the current of poetry written by a man who had loved too intensely to survive intact. She was so submerged in those pages that at first she did not notice the weight of a gaze directed at her from the other end of the hall. Frederick Albrecht von Westerly, Duke of Klagenfurt, had arrived at the ball with the punctuality of a man who fulfilled his social obligations with the same spirit as one visits the dentist. He was 38 years old, 6 years a widower, and bore the reputation of being the most desired and most inaccessible bachelor of the aristocracy. He possessed the impeccable posture of someone who had never needed approval to enter any room. He wore a tailcoat of absolute black, a waistcoat of charcoal grey silk, and carried on his shoulders that particular weight that people who manage things too large acquire over time. It was not arrogance exactly, but the specific solitude of power. His black hair showed the first silver threads at the temples. His dark brown eyes, like wet wood, had a constant quality of evaluation. They looked at things with the attention of an entomologist who classifies and archives, rarely surprised. For 6 years they had tried to marry him off. For 6 years he had attended, observed, evaluated, and returned alone. That night he was leaning against a large marble window on the eastern wall, with a glass of wine in his right hand, observing the hall with the disinterest of one who has already memorized every face present. The orchestra was beginning the second waltz. The couple spun with the mechanical coordination of habit. Then his gaze slid over the crowd, passed over Lady Hilda's group, over her blonde daughters surrounded by suitors, over dozens of faces that did not hold his attention for more than a second, and stopped at the marble column. There, in a chair, was a woman reading. Frederick stood motionless. In her, there was none of those affectations he had learned to recognize and avoid in 20 years of imperial halls. There was no fan moved at a calculated angle. There was no peripheral glance sent strategically in his direction. There was no posture studied to appear casual. She was simply there, completely submerged in a book in the middle of an imperial ball, with the absolute concentration of someone who has found refuge precisely where no one would think to look. And there was something more, something Frederick took an instant to define. The way she sat was not a pose of shyness. It was the posture of a person who had consciously decided not to participate in a spectacle that did not interest her. There was dignity in it, a kind of silent, firm refusal, as if, of all those present in that hall, she were the only one who had something better to do. Frederick left his glass on a servant's tray and began to walk towards her. At that precise moment, Margaret looked up from the book, not because she had noticed movement, but because she had reached the end of a poem and needed a second of pause before the next one. That instant of transition where the mind still holds the images of one text before opening space for another. When her eyes emerged from the pages and found those dark brown eyes advancing directly towards her, she did not look away. That detail, Frederick would remember it later. She did not look away. She did not do so with rehearsed modesty, nor with shame, nor with the calculated tremor of one who wishes to appear surprised. She held his gaze for a long, sincere, slightly questioning second, like someone who evaluates a situation before deciding what to do with it. And then, with a calm that was disconcerting, she turned quietly back to her page of Heine. At that very instant, the murmurs began. The most experienced matrons, strategically placed near the center of the hall, noticed the direction of the Duke's gaze. Heads moved, fans tilted. The whisper spread in waves. He's going towards the eastern column. My God, he's looking at Lady Hilda's niece. It must be a mistake. It is not a mistake. Look how he walks. Lady Hilda noticed and paled with a movement that to any less trained eye would have been indistinguishable from a natural social gesture. She shifted to intercept Frederick, bringing Constance with her, smiling with the calculated breadth of one who offers a solution before the problem is even formulated. Frederick inclined his head towards her with a courtesy that, up close, was practically indistinguishable from a refusal, and continued walking. When he stopped before Margaret, she had already closed the book, slowly, without nervousness, placing a silk ribbon on the corresponding page, as she always did. May I sit? Asked Frederick, indicating the empty chair beside her. It was not the kind of question dukes asked at balls. Dukes announced, requested, expected space to be made for them. That direct, unadorned tone made Margaret hold her breath a fraction of a second. The seat does not belong to me, she replied. I did not ask if it belonged to you, he said. I asked if I may sit. After an instant, she made a slight gesture with her head. It was not exactly an invitation, but neither was it a refusal. Frederick sat down and looked at the book in her hands. Heine, you know him well enough to know it is a curious choice for an imperial ball. Margaret raised her eyes slightly towards him. In that look there was evaluation, not defense, nor adulation, just an honest curiosity. It is also a curious choice to come to an imperial ball and not dance, she replied. Frederick kept silent for a second, and then something happened that seemed to stop the entire hall. The first shadow of a smile that Viennese society had seen on the Duke of Klagenfurt in years appeared on his face. Would you dance with me? Margaret looked at the hall, the matrons immobile with their fans suspended, Adelaide with her mouth barely ajar, and Lady Hilda petrified next to the fountain. Then she looked back at Frederick. You know you dance with me at your own risk. They say I bring bad luck. Many things are said here, he replied, standing up and extending his hand. I have learned not to trust too much in those who speak. Frederick looked at her. Because you did not ask. Everyone asks in an indirect way, wanting to know if I was a good widower. You did not ask because it seemed to you none of your business. Exactly, she replied. Between them fell a silence that was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that appears when two strangers discover that, by chance, they speak the same language. You have chosen the wrong woman to court, Margaret said finally, without bitterness, only with the serene, almost clinical clarity of someone who sincerely believes what they say. I do not have a sufficient dowry to justify your name, and my aunt will see to it that every important circle hears the least kind version of my story. Frederick inclined his head slightly, like someone considering an argument before responding. I have chosen the only woman in this city, he said, who does not look at me as if I were the solution to some problem. The next day, Frederick presented himself officially for a visit at the house of Baroness Hilda. Protocol was respected. The visiting card was delivered in advance. The hour was agreed upon. Lady Hilda received him with a smile beneath which lurked the vigilance of one who keeps a trap open and watches someone who might fall in. Adelaide and Constance were seated at the table, dressed in the best they had. Frederick spent 20 minutes in the parlour, took tea, asked courteous questions about the Baroness's health and the family's plans for the winter season. Before rising, he mentioned, with the tone of one who speaks of the weather, "Send my regards to Margaret. I deeply admire the intelligence she has shown in our conversations. Such a woman is rare in any circle." Lady Hilda held the smile in place thanks to the effort of decades of training, but her eyes cooled several degrees. Margaret was not present at that visit. She was in her room with Heine. But she learned what Frederick had said because Constance, simultaneously furious and fascinated, repeated the phrase during dinner with that aggressive negligence of one who wishes the needle to hit the target. Margaret kept silent for a second, her fork suspended in the air, then continued eating without saying a word. But that night, she took longer than usual to fall asleep. The problem was precisely what she had told Frederick in the library. She could not believe. In 26 years, she had learned to associate attention with a trap, to interpret interest as a prelude to humiliation. She knew, more with her body than with her mind, what it was to be used as a background so that others might appear brighter. And although a part of her, a part that was beginning to awaken with the sudden discomfort of things that have slept too long, recognized something authentic in Frederick's gaze, in the way he had waited for her in the library, in the deliberate choice of his words, another part insisted on the same argument. And what if this is just another form of cruelty that you have not yet learned to recognize? There was also Lady Hilda, whom she could not stop considering, not out of fear. Margaret had lived with that fear all her life and was beginning to tire of it, but out of a sober evaluation of what Lady Hilda was capable of doing. And the honest answer was, a great deal. In the east wing of the mansion, Lady Hilda had a library no one used anymore. Baron Ernest had started that collection, and there it had remained, volumes bound in Moroccan leather of different colours, some with titles in Latin, others in Old French, many with gilded initials on the cover. Lady Hilda did not read, nor did Adelaide and Constance, so the room had been left suspended in time, smelling of old paper and wax, with that particular quality of spaces that conserve the presence of someone who has gone. Frederick asked to see the family library. The request was reasonable, given his position as a patron of letters at court. Lady Hilda could not refuse without creating an uncomfortable situation. Thus, one day towards the end of October, Frederick was guided to the library of the East Wing. Margaret, who knew every tome and every shelf, guided him. Lady Hilda tried to have Constance accompany them. Constance, in a mysterious manner, twisted her ankle. Margaret, who had seen Constance's face when the idea was proposed, suspected the sprain had been very timely. But it happened, and they were left alone among dark shelves and Baron Ernest's books. The light fell obliquely through the high windows, golden and slow. The silence of the room was almost palpable. Margaret showed him the volumes, first the natural history, then the lyric poetry, then the section her father called books for conversing, those he reread most often and in whose margins he left pencil notes. Frederick stopped before one of them, read an annotation in the margin, and looked at her. "Your father wrote in the margins." "It was his way of conversing with the books," said Margaret. In her voice, when she spoke of her father, something different appeared, a tenderness without the usual defensive edges. "How long since you lost him?" 10 years. Frederick held the book for a moment longer and then returned it carefully to the shelf. "I did not cry," said Margaret. The phrase came out suddenly, without intention, as happens with that which has been held back for too long. "At my father's funeral, Lady Hilda said I was cold, that I did not care, that I was strange." She looked at the shelves. "The truth is, I had cried for months while he was ill and I knew I could do nothing. When the day came, I had already cried all I had." Frederick kept silent. He was by the window, and the afternoon light cast a long shadow behind him. "I did not cry either," he said, in a lower voice. "When my wife died, people expected me to. A duke, a public loss, there should have been an appropriate spectacle of mourning. But for 2 years I had watched her drift away, becoming ever more distant from herself. When she finally went, I felt relief, and then guilt for that relief." He paused. "I have not told anyone this in 6 years." Margaret turned towards him. On her face there was not pity. It was something more precise, recognition. "People do not understand," she said, "that true grief sometimes makes no noise." "They do not understand," Frederick agreed. They prefer the spectacle of pain to the truth. He approached slowly and stopped at a respectful distance, but no longer distant. Between them existed that gravitational field of the unspoken. "May I?" he asked, his voice barely rougher. Margaret did not understand the question until she saw his hand move, with an almost reverent slowness, towards the corner of her eye, where a single tear was beginning to gather without her having noticed. With the tip of his thumb, Frederick touched that tear with a delicacy that seemed biologically incompatible with his figure. "You may cry," he said. "Here, no one will judge you." And Margaret, who for years had worn her dignity like armor, did not collapse. She did not sob. She simply allowed one tear, and then another, to fall in silence and with slowness, while Frederick stood before her, still, offering no easy consolations, not saying that everything would be well. He was simply there, with the particular solidity of a man who does not fear the weight of another. There was no kiss, no confession, only two human beings, each of whom had learned to carry in solitude that which weighs more when borne in silence, and who that day discovered that the other could understand without the need for explanations. That was all. And precisely that was what Frederick had seen in her eyes the night of the ball. The winter ball at the Imperial Palace was the most solemn event of the season. Empress Elizabeth, famous for her beauty and her scant disposition to appear in public, graced that night with her presence. The uniforms were more richly embroidered, the jewels heavier, and the social maneuvers more refined. It was the night when a man like Frederick, if he wished to make a declaration that society would take seriously, would find the perfect setting. He arrived early. He found Margaret, who had arrived with Lady Hilda in the usual manner, and before her aunt could place her in some convenient corner, he remained at her side during the first part of the evening, with a naturalness that made his interest clear without turning it into a spectacle. He danced with her twice, the second waltz, and a polka before the intermission. Lady Hilda observed from a strategically chosen point, clutching a closed fan in her hand like someone holding an argument ready for use at the opportune moment. Constance pulled Adelaide to a corner and both whispered with the attention of those planning something. Baroness Bombalursa, Lady Hilda's ally for decades, passed near Frederick during the intermission and commented, loudly enough to be heard, "Disturbing rumours are circulating about the mental health of Lady Hilda's niece. Poor thing, so unstable, what a difficult time for the family." Frederick turned towards her with a courtesy so impeccably icy that the Baroness did not know if she had been insulted or congratulated. "How strange," he said. "I have found her perfectly sane. Sane, in fact, than the majority of the people present in this room." When the orchestra resumed the music and the hall began to move again, Frederick asked the conductor for a minute of attention. It was a simple gesture, a raised hand, but coming from him in that hall, it was enough to make everyone fall silent. Then, he announced, with a voice he did not need to raise to be heard, that he had the intention of formally initiating his courtship of Margaret Eloise Bonasale, and that he requested the corresponding consideration from her family. The silence that followed had its own texture. Margaret felt the blood rise to her face. It was not shame. It was something she took a second to identify, the physical strangeness of being named aloud in a public place as something significant. Lady Hilda, for the first time in many years, found no prepared answer. But as Lady Hilda was Lady Hilda and never surrendered just because a situation became difficult, she acted. The following week, she called her lawyer and prepared documents insinuating irregularities in Baron Ernest's inheritance, attempting to make Margaret's name appear too uncomfortable for a union of that level. It was not a formal accusation, it was a shadow, and in the Viennese court, a shadow was often enough. Frederick sent his own lawyers to the notary's office the next day. What they discovered was exactly the opposite. During 10 years of guardianship, Lady Hilda had carried out a series of transfers that clearly demonstrated, in accounting terms, that significant amounts of Margaret's modest inheritance had been diverted, little by little, carefully but undeniably, to cover the debts of Lady Hilda's daughters and maintain the standard of living of the mansion. When the documents were presented before the legal representative of the Bonasale family in a small room that smelled of old paper and where the grey light of a November day entered through the window, Lady Hilda did not protest, did not invent excuses, did not resort to the repertoire of justifications she had cultivated for decades. She simply remained still for a long instant. Then she stood up, took her gloves and her hat, and left the room without uttering a word. Margaret was present when the door closed behind her aunt. She looked for a moment at the place where Lady Hilda had been sitting, then looked at Frederick, who remained at her side, waiting. "I do not want her destroyed," said Margaret. Her voice was firm, but there was no anger in it. "I want this to end." Frederick looked at her. In his gaze, There was something much harder to name than admiration. It was the particular expression of a man who recognizes in another human being a quality he had lost hope of finding. "Then it will end," he said simply. They married in the spring of 1874, in St. Stephen's Cathedral, on a morning when Vienna smelled of lilacs and the rain that had fallen the night before. The cathedral was full of people who for years had tried not to see Margaret and who now, with the fidelity of those who adapt to the direction of the wind, called her a woman of extraordinary dignity. "We always knew it," they said. Margaret wore a cream silk dress with delicate silver thread embroidery on the neckline and sleeves. In her hair, that same hair that resisted any imposition, she wore small white wildflowers, held with almost invisible hairpins, forming a composition deliberately more natural than any elaborate hairstyle. Her mother's amber brooch was in its usual place, over her heart. When Frederick saw her enter through the central nave, he remained still for a second, not because she seemed unrecognizable, but because she was exactly recognizable, exactly herself. Viennese society had ignored Margaret Bonar Sale for 26 years. From that night on, it began to refer to her as an example of true inner dignity, as if it had always known it. 12 years later, the palace of the Dukes of Klagenfurt was known in two distinct registers, depending on who was asked. For the guidebooks and drawing-room conversations, it was the palace of the Duchess Westerly, the woman who had opened a library and turned the East Wing into a school for ladies. For those who lived within those walls, it was simply home. 12 autumns had passed. The palace gardens, which Frederick had maintained for years as formal and geometrically perfect, now had whole areas that Margaret had convinced the head gardener to let grow with more freedom. Mixed flower beds with wild herbs, old rose bushes supported by iron arches, a stone bench under an ancient oak where she used to sit and read on sunny days. The seasons spoke their own language there. August smelled of lavender and dried thyme, October of leaves and damp wood, December of fir resin and warm bread coming from the kitchens. Stephen, the firstborn, was 10 years old and had inherited from both parents what Frederick described as a bothersome tendency to ask questions about things people preferred to leave unanswered. He was a boy of dark hair and amber eyes, Margaret's eyes, that still sometimes surprised Frederick when he saw his son cross a hallway. Clara, the middle daughter, was 7, and her character resembled a small organized storm, methodical, determined, with a capacity for logical argument that had already defeated 3 different governesses. And Joseph, the youngest, 4 years old, spent much of his time in someone's arms, observing the world with the silent tranquility of one who is still deciding what to think of everything. Margaret opened the library 3 years after the wedding. At first, only discreetly, for women who knew how to read but had no access to books. Then she expanded the hours to Mondays and Fridays. Later, she hired an instructor for the Saturday morning classes. By 1882, there were 60 women of different social ranks on the waiting list to attend the palace library, embroiderers alongside baronesses, daughters of artisans beside daughters of merchants, all sitting on the same oak chairs under the same bronze lamps, reading the same volumes. Vienna contemplated this with a mixture of scandal and admiration that was, in essence, its way of digesting everything it did not know how to classify. Frederick, who for decades had believed he knew what admiration was, discovered alongside Margaret that he had confused admiration with superficial respect. What he felt for her, a feeling that did not weaken but became more precise and profound as she became more fully herself, was something else. It was that kind of love that begins when the initial passion settles and what remains proves to be even more solid than what existed before. The love of mornings with cold tea because both had begun reading and forgotten to drink it, of discussions about different approaches to the same problem after which both ended up understanding the issue better, of nights when one of the children woke with a fever and both opened their eyes at the same time, not out of duty but because between the sleep of one and the sleep of the other, there no longer existed a clear frontier. Lady Hilda Bonar Sale lived in a modest house in Salzburg, maintained with a discreet pension that Margaret had assigned and paid punctually each month, without changes. There was no more communication, no theatrical forgiveness, no reconciliation displayed before the world, only the simple and firm gesture of a woman who refused to reproduce the cruelty she had suffered, choosing generosity not as a spectacle but as a posture. Adelaide married a cavalry officer from Innsbruck. Constance gave piano lessons. One day in October, always October, in Klagenfurt, with that special quality of light that makes the leaves of the oaks golden and turns the world into something halfway between reality and a painting, Margaret was walking with Joseph through the wild part of the garden. The small hand of the child was inside hers when he stopped before a rose bush that had climbed over an arch and spread out over the iron gate. "Mamma, this rose has escaped," he said, with the logical certainty of his 4 years. "It has escaped," Margaret confirmed. And that way, it is more beautiful. She looked at the rose, its twisted branches growing towards where there was space, its small wild flowers of a washed-out apricot color, and felt something settle in her chest with the gentleness of things that finally find their place. That way, it is more beautiful, she accepted. Frederick was by the library window when he saw them return. He observed Margaret cross the garden with Joseph in her arms, one of her large hands holding the small boy's knee. Both were speaking of something he could not hear, but that made them laugh. In her, there still existed the same quality that had stopped him in the hall of the Herzenberg Palace 12 years before, an imperfection he had never sought, a depth that had taken years to know, the integrity of a person who, despite all pressures, had refused to become someone different. She raised her gaze towards the window, saw him, and did not smile.